On the outskirts of Rotherham, in a draughty school corridor, thick with chalk dust and cruelty, a boy is cornered. His name is Brian Wade. He's small, quiet, delicate in manner, and that is enough. They mock his voice, his walk, his softness. They pull at his satchel, drag him to the ground, and call him things he will never forget. To them, it's just another lunchtime torment. To Wade, it's something else entirely. He won't scream. He won't fight back. He will simply remember. And in time, he will repay. Years later, Wade would hint that one of those boys, now grown, was found bleeding behind a truck. He never confirmed if the man survived. He didn't care, because by then, Brian Wade had changed. This is the story of a killer unlike any other. No bravado, no fame, no gimmicks. Just quiet vengeance, delivered with cold precision over and over again. He wasn't in the papers for long. He wasn't mentioned on true crime podcasts. But make no mistake, Brian Wade is one of the most dangerous men to ever walk free in Britain. He killed. He was released. He killed again. And when he smiled at you and said, "Top of the morning, another happy day," he meant it. England, 1966. The country was smiling. The Beatles were conquering America. England were about to win the World Cup. The high streets were alive with bunting and excitement. It was a time of pride, a time of swagger. And in a small soot-covered terrace house on Woodview Place, overlooking Canklow Woods and the distant outline of Bolton Castle, Brian Wade was boiling. He lived there with his family, number 3, built in the 1930s, same as the others. The houses were tight, the air thick, with the smell of chip fat and wet dog. Everyone knew everyone. And everyone knew Brian Wade was off. He didn't smile, he didn't chat. He worked as a machinist at a local factory. Steady hours, silent days. But beneath that stillness, he was stewing in grievances, real or imagined. To most, Canklow was just another working-class community in Rotherham. To Wade, it was a labyrinth of enemies. Neighbours, co-workers, passers-by, all part of a grand paranoid theatre in his mind. But one man in particular had drawn his attention. Edwin Percy Cardwell, a father, a husband, a steel worker, and a war veteran. He lived 2 doors down. He was 45. He had the misfortune of asking Wade, politely, to stop revving his motorbike in the early hours of the morning. That was all. A gentle neighbourly complaint. A reasonable request. But in Wade's fractured mind, it was a declaration of war.
Brian Wade never shouted. He never threw punches in the street. His was a quiet anger, the kind that ferments, that hides, the kind that sharpens. As a child in post-war Rotherham, Wade was different. He was soft-spoken, effeminate, solitary. He was also, by his own later admission, a homosexual, in a world that treated such a thing as perverse, not just illegal, but mocked, beaten, feared. They hounded him for it, at school, in the street. Sometimes, in his own home, he learned to hold everything in. The fear, the shame, the rage. He internalized it all, and somewhere along the way, it twisted. In Wade's mind, every slight became deliberate. Every laugh was an attack. People weren't just inconsiderate. They were conspirators in a plot to humiliate him. By 1966, he had no friends, no romantic attachments. What he did have was a list. Not written, not spoken, but remembered. Every person who crossed him, every look, every laugh, every word. And near the top of that list was Edwin Cardwell. What makes Brian Wade terrifying isn't just what he did. It's how long he waited to do it.
It was late, well past midnight, when Edwin and Betty Cardwell turned off the light. Their children were asleep. The house on Woodview Place was quiet, save for the distant rustle of wind from Canklow woods. They had been married for years. He worked at the steelworks, came home, watched the telly. She made tea, folded laundry, read her magazine. Their life was ordinary and safe. As they whispered goodnight, neither could have imagined that someone was already moving down the street with murder in his heart. Brian Wade, 21 years old, he had drunk heavily that night. But this wasn't chaos, it wasn't rage. This was purpose. He walked calmly from his house. He crossed the road. He didn't run. He didn't knock. He simply walked through the back door, unlocked, as many were back then. He crept in like a shadow, and with the sledgehammer gripped tight, he approached the sleeping figure of Edwin Cardwell, and then he brought it down. Once, twice, again, a crack, a wet sound. Betty stirs. She thought he'd fallen, that he'd knocked something over. She reached for the light, and there, bathed in yellow glow, she saw it. Blood everywhere. On the pillow, the wall. On Edwin's face, what was left of it. And the sledgehammer already dropped. Brian Wade was gone. Wade returned home, silent, calm. When arrested shortly after, he simply said, "I think I've killed a man I had trouble with last week." It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a message. The first item crossed off his list. Word spread quickly. Edwin Cardwell was dead. Killed in his bed with a sledgehammer. Betty Cardwell, stunned, blood-stained, was the one who found him. Neighbours peered through curtains. Policemen whispered. Nobody could believe it, except one man. At Rotherham police station, Brian Wade was in interview, waiting to give his account of the events. He looked them in the eyes and said, "I did it." There were no tears, no apologies, just a calm, clinical account of the night. He felt disrespected, he said. The man had crossed him. He'd kept the rage bottled for days. Then released it with iron and bone. Later, Brian would be transferred to court where, at Sheffield Assizes, Wade pled guilty to murder. Witnesses described him as still, emotionless, and cold. No family members spoke on his behalf. Psychiatric testimony suggested he was not normal but fit to plead. The judge described the act as one of the most callous and calculated acts of domestic violence I've ever encountered. Wade was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was just 21 years old. Most assumed that was the end of the story. But it was only chapter 1. So That is the end of chapter 1. But it's not the end of the story. Not even close. Because Brian Wade didn't vanish into the prison system. He didn't fade into obscurity. He waited. He stitched toys. He listened to classical music. And then he struck again. This isn't just the tale of a brutal killing in 1966. It's the origin story of one of Britain's most disturbing, most underreported serial killers. A man who killed, was released, and killed again this time with a machete and a dictaphone in his coat pocket. In the next episode, we'll take you deep into Wakefield Prison, to a moment when Wade Quiet, withdrawn, stabbed another inmate 9 times over a scrap of cloth, and then years later walked free. Free to kill a young man called Jonathan Abel in what will become one of the most chilling cases of parole failure in modern history.
That is very well put, my dear son, how you have matured into the intellectual sleuth you are today. Your mother would have been so proud. Yes. You have to understand, Wade wasn't a man with an anger problem. He was a high-functioning predator, polite, patient, calculated. He bided his time. And every time the system forgot him, he made them remember. He wasn't a man who slipped through the cracks. He was a man who stood in the crack and waited for the lights to go out.
Thank you, Father. That's why this case matters. Not just because of what he did, but because of what we failed to stop. So don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the bell to be notified when Chapter 2 is released. It'll either be out in the next few weeks, or if you're watching this long after release, well, it's probably already waiting for you, just like Brian Wade.